Thanks as always for listening. In today's episode, Chris and I talk about how to use canon characters like Spock or Han Solo or Cobra Commander in your games. If you want to skip over our introductions and hello, go to about the 2:15 mark, and that's where we get into the content. Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Good morning, Chris.
Definitely not.
Well,
Pitch black.
So, oh. What
It
time's
won't
the
be
sun
long
going
before
down?
I am running in the pitch black because we moved the clocks back. Now it gets dark here at 4. Yeah.
So have you, in the last few weeks, done any gaming of any sort whatsoever?
Role playing, no. Like literally, Scott has been unavailable for, well, funnily enough, like us, for the whole of October and this week. He's had things going on, so he hasn't been able to. So me and Brian have been playing a lot of miniatures gaming.
Okay.
Me and Brian actually went to Element Games in Stockport and played a miniatures game together. So we did doubles. It was really strange. You played on the same. I've played team games before, but that's always each of you are playing individually, but it's your team against the other team. This was we both played on the same table with our miniatures against 2 other people on the same table. So it was quite good fun because it was it was 2 against 2. We did badly and came bottom of the event, but
it's a game. Fun. If you have fun, that's what's important.
So that was important. So yeah, it was quite
very good. Well, we started. We finally signed off what has been like almost 2 months of one-offs, and it was one-offs because the 5e campaign ended, and it was like one person wasn't going to be available, just availability, me on vacation, blase. So we finally ended the one-offs, and we did the first session of our Pathfinder via Castles and Crusades, and it went really well. I think it went really well. The modifications that I had to make, given the materials, like I found a lot of what's the friggin' word? Well, we can talk about that some other time. What I do want to talk about is our topic for today, which is your idea, and I think a fine one. And I've put a good amount of thought into it over the last couple of weeks since you brought it up. That's true, actually.
I did definitely see an idea for this online somewhere. It may even have been on a I literally was one of those things. As I'm scrolling through Facebook. Speaking of Facebook, I just sent you a message. As I was scrolling through Facebook, I saw something about would you? I think it was Star Trek. It was like, would you let the players meet, or how do you deal with the players meeting canon characters? And I was like, actually, that's a really good point, because I've done this in Star Wars, so that's 2 of the ones we're going to talk about. So yeah, this idea is, how do you deal with meeting canon characters in role-playing games?
Yeah, and what I'm thinking is canon NPCs from existing settings. So we're not saying you're playing Indiana Jones or you're playing Mr. Spock. You're playing Star Trek Adventures and you encounter Dr. McCoy.
Yeah, because if you're playing the characters, that's already
different animal.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, so I think your idea, by the way, of splitting this in half, because this is more than just general ideas. I think based on genre and the systems that we will mention as examples as tied to the genre, I think there's a little more detail we can go into. So we're going to split this in half in accordance with how do you want to split this? So the people know.
Because the ones we've already mentioned. So I've done this previously with Star Wars. The one I'd heard about was Star Trek. And because we've done G.I. Joe recently, let's just shoehorn that in there as well. So we can kind of go with a sci-fi kind of modern type thing. And then we might do a further episode on looking at sort of fantasy, which might be coming a lot more off fiction. So it's one of those things, isn't it? Like Star Trek and Star Wars are coming from TV, G.I. Joe's coming from comics and cartoons. But a lot of fantasy comes from fiction. So, you mentioned Middle Earth, so that's Forgotten Realms. I mean, you mentioned Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, all the characters that comes from books. Yeah. It's funny, that, isn't it, really, that we still don't have a lot of fantasy films or TV. It's all literature.
Yeah, anyway, in terms of like, call it like alpha source material. But so yeah, I think so. We'll focus on Star Wars, Star Trek, and GI Joe.
We'll mention GI Joe, and if some of the stuff we say might be generic stuff for how to deal with canon characters, but I've got examples of specifics for example, for Star Wars, for Star Trek, and so on.
Yeah. So the idea here, and this is how I interpreted when you brought this up, is your characters, the player characters, are novel. They're player created. They're novel characters within an existing setting. And in some way, shape, or form, you as GM say, oh, I would like to have Captain Kirk show up, or Admiral Kirk, or Lieutenant Kirk, whatever flavor of Kirk you want that week. Or I want to have, they're going to meet General Solo or something like that. Or I'll bring up, when we talk about fantasy, Def Leppard. But that's a whole, oh yeah, baby. That's a whole nother story. Listeners, that is a teaser. You better listen to the fantasy version of this one, because Def Leppard will make an appearance. Anyway, how do you deal with these? So what are your first thoughts, and which one do you want to talk about first? Your idea, you take the reins first.
Let's start with Star Trek first, because actually I think Star Trek is easier. The reason I say Star Trek is easier is mostly because when you think of Star Wars, when you say Star Wars, most people think the Skywalker saga. So you kind of have this run through of big storyline. So most of the major characters in Star Wars hit that line. So I think actually that is harder to deal with. So Star Trek, I think to some extent is easier because, we've seen 2 programs now that have done a good job of it. So I'll go with Lower Decks. Lower Decks is stuck into a time. Okay, it's slightly after, sort of Picard and, well, actually, no, it's pretty, I think, is it before? It's around the same time.
It's after, but it's putting aside Discovery's 30th century stuff, Lower Decks is the farthest ahead, the farthest down the road chronologically.
It's around a time, so most of the other characters from Next Generation and Deep Space Nine do exist. So we've had an episode where they go to Deep Space Nine.
Yep.
And they've bumped into, like, Riker has turned up a bunch of times because he's the captain of the Titan, and the Titan's a really kick-ass ship because Riker's in charge.
Because Riker, yeah.
And, things like that. So I think to some extent that's what makes Star Trek an easy thing to do, because you're probably, one of the things when you play in Star Trek, we did this, you make your ship and you almost come up with your entire crew of your ship, which means it's therefore very, very easy to not have to worry about the main guys. So let's just go back because you already mentioned it, Kirk and stuff. We've also seen them do this in Strange New Worlds. Now, that's a weird one because it is actually on the Enterprise. But even then, half the crew are characters that, we didn't really know about. Discovery also did this, but Discovery did it badly.
Okay, so let me jump in. This is not a perspective that I thought of, and it's interesting. You're saying, with the idea of a ship, lots of people on board, or a station, lots of people on board, or a colony world, whatever.
Yeah.
That there would be lots of room to have, like, if you wanted to run a Lower Decks, whether you want to run a comedy or not, if you wanted to run like that level in the rank structure type of campaign, plugging in canon characters, or even like canon B level characters, like Captain
if you wanted to do Lower Decks,
like that's easy because they're just up there.
You could literally go, right, Lower Decks is on the Enterprise, but you are Lower Deckers on the Enterprise.
Yeah.
And then that would
at
be
any
fine.
point in the Enterprise's history.
Yeah. So that would actually work fine. And we'll come back to the kind of the elephant in the room, silly, stupid players in a bit. But that would work fine. And then it's not an issue at all. You are Lower Deckers on the Enterprise. So if Kirk or Picard or those
whoever,
gives you an order or sends you on a away mission, if you get to go on an away mission with Riker, you're in for a good time, and there's probably going to be sex involved because that's how Riker was, or Kirk for that matter. However, if you are in the original series and you are wearing a red shirt,
you might die.
Yeah. But you can still jump in with, if you could be part of the medical team and you get to work with Bones, you're part of the science team, you get to work with Spock. But that's fine. But that's just one suggestion. So let's carry on with and then I'll come to the other way we can do it.
I think that this angle, like if you wanted to take that angle, you have, as a GM, you have the advantage of already having very clear character sketches of all those major canon NPCs, that playing them would be easy. Now, this is overriding. This is universally applicable in my mind for use of canon NPCs. Is I think that you have to have a light touch. You know, like if you're playing lower decks on the Enterprise and Kirk is always showing up doing stuff, Kirk is always going to be like the neutron star in the room. He's always going to have like the greatest gravitational pull.
Yep.
And so I think that you would enhance and you would clarify the feel of the story, the campaign, by setting it on the Enterprise, like during Pike's captaincy. But if Pike is always showing up, you end up then either watering down Pike as a character, or you water down the role of, you create Pike as this kind of lame-o Mary Sue. Like Elminster shows up and solves I hate that. And so I think you have to have a light touch, but that would be an easy way to do it because the character sketches are all there, and that structure rank-wise is already there.
Yeah, I think like Lower Decks itself shows how to do that pretty well, because there are bridge crew on the ship, but the bridge crew very rarely take over. Almost always it's the 4 characters doing, or sometimes they split up, but they tend to be doing something, or they're doing it maybe with a bridge mate, but very rarely is the bridge crew taking over. Now, partly that's because the bridge crew in Lower Decks are pretty inept, so it's not the same comparison to the Enterprise. But I think, that's one way of doing it. Now, obviously, the other way I think you do start, which is very easy, is the way it's done as written, is that you have your own ship. You have your own ship. You might even be the bridge crew. You might not be, but that still gives you plenty of opportunity to, this week you do come across the Titan, or you go to Deep Space Nine, like you do in Lower Decks, or if you're setting it during, the original series or Next Generation, there's certain things are going to happen. Now, some of those are awkward. And this is kind of brings more. So you're generally week to week stuff is going to be fine. You go along. If you go to a space station and, Sulu's there, you get to meet Sulu. Yay, cool. Maybe you'd have a little character thing like that, or someone's, you go to, what is it? Risa that they're always going to. And,
Risa with the little, little porno statues.
And as a murder mystery or something like, you can do that. You have another character there. That's cool. Where you do occasionally have issues, I think this is more in the Next Generation than original series, and it would be really hard if you're running it in Deep Space Nine, like in that time period, is you have got certain events that are going to happen.
Correct.
So like if you're doing Next Generation, if you said it before Wolf 359, well, a huge chunk of the Starfleet was destroyed at Wolf 359. So your ship can't be there.
Yeah.
Or it can be there and you survive. If you set it around after that, then you've got the whole problem that you're going to have, I can't remember, but essentially you're going to have the whole Deep Space Nine Dominion War, the Cardassian War, and all of that stuff. Now, after that, you think, we're okay for a bit. Well, no, because then you've got the Romulan fallout, and then you've got, things do actually happen. Actually, the original series is a lot easier for that.
Yeah, it's a lot less well-defined.
Yeah, well, they went off and did their own thing, really. They kind of went off, they did their own thing. You can kind of say anything is happening, and you don't have big events. If you ran during that period, it's fine, which is why the games suggest that you set it essentially after Deep Space Nine, where you've got, 10 years where nothing happens.
Here's my issue, and with it, question. And this is actually where I put most of my thought as I considered this topic over the last few weeks, is how do you deal with, I think when you're talking about injecting canon characters, like, you say, okay, from like a fun standpoint, you run into Sulu and, you want to indulge your players' love of that character by like, you meet, this Sulu and he's working out in the holodeck and he invites you to join him on his Three Musketeers holodeck adventure or something silly like that. You know what I mean? And then it's like a little 5-minute interlude and it makes your players feel kind of cool, and that's fun. I personally think that has a very short shelf life. I think that you as GM are risking coming across as, or in fact, offloading your job of creating a story on like the momentum of someone else's character. You also risk having that because let's face it, canon NPCs they're major NPCs. They're major players in the setting. There's no such thing as like a recurring NPC that's utterly meaningless to that story. And so you can't just kill off people or nullify what makes them them. So you risk, again, like the Mary Sue thing or the Elminster, you risk having destabilizing and marginalizing your players' characters, or you distort what that canon character is by minimizing it. Like when I was just riding my bike, I was thinking, like you take your Starfleet character and you go into a Starfleet bar, and your Starfleet character has his like cute Starfleet girlfriend, and Lieutenant Kirk comes in. And Lieutenant Kirk is going to take your date. He's going to take your date. That's just the way it is. And if he doesn't, if he fails miserably, then he's not really Lieutenant Kirk, you know? And so
Yeah.
it might be fun to like remind you of how much cooler Kirk is than your character, but I think that has a very short shelf life. So for me, there's two major issues. Is this like, how do you do so well in a way that doesn't distort the character, the NPC, or marginalize the PC? And also, how do you handle this mechanically? I mean, do you have Spock? Spock shows up. Does Spock roll a reason plus science, and then Spock fails? Like Spock doesn't fail. Dr.
Well,
McCoy doesn't not come up with the, you know what I mean? How do you deal with the mechanics of it?
I think luckily in Star Trek you already have things built into it because, for example, if you're doing a science thing or a medicine thing, then you're doing I can't remember what it's called.
Scientific method.
You're doing that like extended task thing where your whole point is you are coming up with a theory, and then so Spock can suggest one theory and your character suggests another one. Now if they go with Spock's theory, great, but then everyone gets to roll, so everyone's taking part in that, and it doesn't really matter then if Spock doesn't have brilliant roles because everybody else is joining in as well. So I think the game actually already has that built in. I think where it's harder is if you get into combat situations, because then you can't have Spock and randomly killed by a Klingon. No. Luckily, you have points, so you can use basically protect him with threat. And it's that one thing I always get confused with that in 2D20 is whether when you've got an NPC that is a friendly NPC, what resource are they using? Because if you use your threat to make that NPC better, that's helping the PC.
Correct. That's a good point.
But then should you be spending the player's momentum? Because that seems unfair as well. So I've never seen that clearly explained. It's always treated that like threat is an antagonistic thing. But what happens if you've got a helper? Anyway, that's a completely different thing. Yeah, I think mechanically you've got tools in example in 2D20 that's not a huge issue. Because of the way it's set up with the science stuff. Like I said, combat I think is hard. I think your idea of the holodeck thing is great though. That's a really good way of putting you in a situation where no one can die.
Yeah.
You can still have fun with, getting to go and do a thing with Picard or Data on the Enterprise, doing some holodeck thing, or something with Deep Space Nine people in one of Quark's holodecks. That'd be a really good way of getting to do something with those characters. But there's and it's fun and you would enjoy it. And it feels like there is a bit of a reason to it because, the holodeck episodes, although they to some extent were always a bit pointless, they were some of the best episodes.
Yeah.
So you can make holodeck episodes really good, even though really there's no real threat there. I mean, as long as assuming you don't do the holodeck safeties are off, like again.
Here's my thought though. You said like with combat, I actually think it's bigger than combat because, but
when
like
it comes to this stuff,
there are certain things that Han Solo is going to be able to do, and if he can't do those things successfully, he's not really Han Solo.
I think but we're doing this inside the thing of a role-playing game where what everyone's character is, characters are statted and characters are statted, but they have better chances. So, Spock will have really good stats. Han Solo will have really good stats. That doesn't mean they succeed all the time. And actually, if you look at Star Wars, the main characters in Star Wars fail loads.
That's true.
So it's less of an issue. I'm with you that on Star Trek characters do succeed, but they don't always succeed.
No,
a lot of the time,
though.
It is like House, where it takes them 3 or 4 times to get to the correct thing, and it wasn't lupus. And
it takes several patients convulsing.
Yeah, they don't always get to the correct answer. So even at Spock, and Spock's a genius, he doesn't always get to the answer straight away.
No, but like here's my thing. Like if I were going to have Spock, let's say this is pre-original series era, so pre-Kirk's Enterprise. It's like Pike's Enterprise era.
Yeah.
And you decide to have you have your own ship. Actually, like I was running, what was it, like a year and a half ago, USS Excalibur, same time period.
Yeah.
So they run into Enterprise, and say they're at some like scientific conference, okay, and Spock is there, as lieutenant, whatever it is, Spock is there, and some kind of scientific thing comes up, and they Spock as a character, you've got Spock's stats from that era, and so you are going to have him involved in the scientific method exercise. I personally would not do that. Like, I would not actually have Spock involved in a, like, as a full character mechanically. I would, and this is what I was thinking of, like with 2D20, I would look at his stats and maybe determine, like, okay, he gets, what's his science? What's his reason? I would give him a personal momentum pool, or I would give him a
Yeah.
pool of successes. I would treat him narratively with some level of mechanical structure, like, and it would probably be X number of successes that Spock can just spend. Because what I wouldn't think about this, if you were going to use a major NPC in a scientific method exercise in Star Trek Adventures, you would be, as GM, playing that character.
Yeah.
Unless you said, all right, here, use Spock as a meat puppet. You know, then you just hand him to the players. That's kind of that's kind of silly. I think that then you as GM have to play the character, which means, like, how do you inject ideas into the scientific method or whatever problem they're trying to solve without you either being a distractor, a non-entity, or you're feeding the party, you're giving them an unfair and I think actually kind of dissatisfying answer, because you as GM are solving the problem that you're giving to the players. I personally hate that as a player. I hate doing that as a GM. So I would rather just have Spock, like, maybe throw some successes at it, say, okay, he's able to contribute some things. Or maybe if your players are completely out there in left field, you use the voice of reason via Spock to offer something to get them thinking. But in thinking about G.I. Joe, in thinking about Star Wars, in thinking about all these different properties, and your proposition of how to use canon characters, I would not treat them mechanically in any way like a regular character. I would just give them a certain number of successes, unless I wanted to accept the burden of, like, okay, Cobra Commander is involved in this fight. He's on, like, the lava, he's on the ice flow in the lava canyon because it's G.I. Joe, why not? You know, and if Flint could kill Cobra Commander, like push him into the damn lava there. You could do that. Then you run him with his stats. But unless you want to fully accept that possibility, which then could dramatically change the setting because you're changing the characters that make the setting in part what it is, you have them sit outside the mechanics. And then you can have them come in and deftly, you as GM, have them provide those touch points and those little sprinkles of flavor to make it feel like, oh, you just encountered General Solo and it was cool, without him taking over, or without you distorting what Solo is and turning him into, like, oh, Solo comes up and, Solo sits down and, like, he drools or he farts or something. It's like you turn him into, like, this parody of the character so as to, like, make fun of him and lampoon him.
I mean, you certainly could do that. You can do that with any NPC. I think most of the things we're talking about, with the exception of Jedis that we'll get to, I don't think these characters are so overpowered that are going to take that much away from the players. And also, when we're talking about 2D20, 2D20 is a system where it is pretty easy on the players. Like, generally, as a player, if you want to succeed, you're going to succeed. And it's the same as if you, like, so if you're worried between that, do I want Spock to fail, or I don't want it to fail? Pretty much in 2D20, if you want a character to succeed, you can make sure you do it by spending your various meta currencies. And if you want them to fail, you can kind of also do the same thing. So if you want them to be infallible. So I don't think it's as much as an issue as you're worried about. I know you're like what you're saying. You don't want Spock to seem like he's rubbish, but you also don't want him to seem that like he's like God Spock and can do everything.
Well,
I actually think 2D20 is a thing where he could do it. But you're right. You need to think carefully about what is the role this character is going to be playing.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the Obi-Wan Kenobi role where he's overseeing and he's giving some advice, but he's not really? But he's then going to go. He's going to leave. The Gandalf thing. He's going to disappear, and the players are left doing their own thing.
You can't turn into your 13-year-old DM self, who takes your own favorite character and suddenly has that character show up with, like, 10 more levels, and that character then is, like, the badass in the story. You know what I mean? Like, you can't do that.
you need to think carefully about what you're doing. Like, so I think Star Trek, I think we reasonably cover. I generally, you don't have a lot of combat in Star Trek, but even when you do, I can't imagine any of the actual canon characters are that amazing. Maybe Worf is like pretty decent in combat, Data
Oh, sure.
possibly,
Should be.
because they're like literally superhuman. But you are still very much limited by the fact that you can only fight one person at a time. So if you really want to, like, right, well, I'm going to have Worf and I'm going to have Data, but I want them to have a challenge, just throw the Borg at them, because or the Jem'Hadar, they're still only going 1-to-1.
Yeah.
With somewhere like the Jem'Hadar or the Borg, your players are then still like, if your players go, we'll just sit back and let Data and Worf do the job. Well, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
They're going to get killed. You're going to have to join in. They're not going to do the work for you. And if it's, Kirk flighting Klingons, I mean, actually, a lot of the time in Star Trek, the bad guys were always more powerful than the good guys. So I don't think it'll be, like too much of an issue. I mean, there's certainly points in Picard where like one character turns up and takes that whole room of people.
Yeah.
But you're like, that, with the exception of that, I've not really seen that happen. I mean, like Spock maybe does it sometimes when he's Spock sort of, oh yeah, I forgot I am actually super strong and really good at fighting, because Spock most of the time doesn't do that kind of thing.
No.
So I think Star Trek is.
You think it's
sorry, I think
okay.
Star Trek. I think Star Trek's less of an issue because I think science is normally done as a group thing anyway. So it's harder for one person. That can always happen in any group exercise. One person can stand out. I think it's less of a problem there. I think on a bridge situation, everyone's doing their own thing anyway. And I think in a combat thing, you can, again, it's probably a group against a group. So I don't think one person's going to dominate.
Yeah,
so I think
also, you make a good point that mechanically, if you look at the canon characters like Ben Sisko or whoever, whatever, doesn't matter. They are not compared to.
He's not doing anything good.
Huh?
He's not doing anything useful. I'm going to write a story in the middle of this fight.
No, he's not.
Here's Jake. Oh, you said
cool.
Ben, not Jake. Sorry, I'm thinking of the.
No, Jake Sisko is a cowardly little worm. But you know what? Not every character has to be heroic. He spotlights a piece of an unfortunate part of human nature. But Ben Sisko mechanically is not compared to a player character. It's not like, oh, you have a 4th level wizard and suddenly Bigby shows up. It's not the same. Like the gap. And again, fantasy opens up the doors to all kinds of weirdness. But yeah, I think the way that 2D20 with Star Trek Adventures does it does solve some of the issues. My thing though is I counsel prudence in the extent to which these canon characters would be involved in moving the story along. And again, it goes back to those 2 warnings that I gave earlier. What about Star Wars? Because you said you think this is.
I'll go to Star Wars later because I want to just jump off something you said, which takes us into the G.I. Joe stuff. One of the things you just said is like the disparity between the sort of the players and the canon characters. Now we can do that in Star Wars, but I'll leave Star Wars a bit. We've just said in 2D20, actually, that disparity isn't massive. Yeah, the bridge crew is going to be a better than the player characters, but the player characters are still already pretty competent. Now, one of the reasons we've said that we, for example, for G.I. Joe you shouldn't use the system that's provided, is because it does work on a level system. From what I understand, I've read bits of it. You start with like a level 1 character, and people like Cobra Commander and Destro and some of the, the main G.I. Joes, they're like level 18, 19, and 20, and they're untouchable. Now, that means that actually, if you try to do a situation where, Snake Eyes is going to be a part, but Snake Eyes will literally wipe the floor with all of the lower level things. So the only thing
Storm
you
Shadow.
could do, you'd have to have Snake Eyes is going to have to fight Storm Shadow because none of the PCs are capable of fighting Storm Shadow because he's like a Tarrasque or something in D&D terms. So you can't fight Storm Shadow because he'll just destroy you all instantly. So you have to fight some basic Cobra like soldiers because Snake Eyes is going to have to go and he's in the background fighting Storm Shadow because you can't possibly do it. That's why we said we weren't keen on the system. Now, in 2D20, that would be less of an issue. Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow will be way more capable than your characters, but your characters could, with clever planning or teaming up, could potentially take on Storm Shadow. Where we have a whole different problem now is, but do we want to? Do we want the play? If the Storm Shadow attacks the Joe base and the only Joes there are your characters because they're on everybody else is on a training
Everyone's
exercise.
at like an HR presentation.
So you've now got to fight Storm Shadow because he's trying to break Cobra Commander out again. But do
Yeah,
you let the PCs kill Storm Shadow? Well, luckily, because of what you said previously about G.I. no, characters don't die in G.I. so it's not an issue.
right.
And there's plenty of systems, and you could probably do it in 2D20 where you're going to spend some threat and, he disappears.
The other thing, wait a minute, the other thing too about that, like that as an example, all the Joes are at their annual HR presentation about bloodborne pathogens or something like that, the Joes are at their sexual harassment HR presentation, and the junior Joes are the only ones left because you did it already. And Storm Shadow attacks. You could use Storm Shadow as is, like if you were going to use the Joe rules that are out there now, where Storm Shadow would wipe the floor with them. And nobody dies. That applies to the characters, the PCs as well. You could use that in that mechanical disparity to drive home what a badass Storm Shadow is, and that these Joes need to be clever, or they need to get some different equipment, or, and this I wouldn't do this, like they need to enlist the help of Snake Eyes. In other words, they need to make themselves spectators and just fob off the work on someone better than them. But I do think that you could use that if there's a significant mechanical disparity between the canon characters and the player characters. You could use that as a way to drive home, like, oh my gosh, that's how badass, whatever this, who were those Imperial Guards in the red outfits?
Christ, Royal Guards?
They're not called
something like that.
You know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
They're called Royal Guards.
The ones, the ones in red. So yeah, like how badass they are. Okay. That could be something.
I think G.I. Joe is an interesting one because G.I. Joe is based purely around conflict. So when we get to Star Wars, there's a third different thing again. But G.I. Joe is all about conflict. So you are almost always...
Every G.I. Joe episode devolves to shooting.
Yeah. So in G.I. Joe, you might not always have the famous Joes on your team because, it might be right. Well, group Team A, you're doing this, and Team B, you're doing this, and Team A is your players, and Team B is the main Joes.
Yeah.
So I know sometimes they are going to be with you, helping you, and you still have the same pitfalls, but you can still avoid it, just like we've said for Star Trek. But you're almost always going to be fighting against named bad guys. I mean, not always, but yes, there's going to be a bunch of like the rubbishy like Cobra bad guys, and then there's going to be some like Hiss commandos. But then you are going to be fighting against Zartan or Destro or the Baroness or Professor, whatever his name is, or Cobra Commander, because those are going to be the main guys. Yeah, that's it. So you are going to be having to fight against those guys. So actually, when you'd said previously, the bad guys shouldn't die, and I was like, that's stupid. No, actually, that works because otherwise you just go through all of the bad guys in like one campaign, and you've got no one left because you killed them all. Yeah. I think where you do have a problem is what do you do when a player kind of goes, right, well, we've captured him. I take my knife, I slit it across his throat.
Well, remember we talked about that a G.I. Joe game has to have a mechanical story mechanism to deal with morality because Joe is there, but between bouts of Joe fighting Cobra, Joe is walking around neighborhoods giving kids advice to like not light their farts on fire and things like that. Don't jump your BMX bike off the roof. That's what Joe does in his downtime. So there is that moral dimension. I think the solution mechanically with G.I. Joe is to run it using 2D20 because then that favors the characters and it also squishes the gap mechanically between the best and the average. Whereas a level-based system is just gonzo.
Yeah. And that's why I think, so actually, again, I think it works. I don't think it's an issue. It's super helpful in G.I. Joe because the bad guys don't really die. They go unconscious, you put them in prison, they escape. Now
nobody escapes, and there's no accountability for those crappy prisons, but that's beside the point.
So then, you're playing in a system where you're always with canon characters, but because no one dies, there's not really a problem there. And if you want to kill someone,
it's not going to destabilize the setting because you remove, like, you kill Serpentor.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now what? Well, now Cobra Commander takes over again. Well, does that change anything? And if it doesn't change anything, that's not a particularly interesting story element. Maybe it was interesting when you, took one of Serpentor's snakes and you strangled him with it, a la Jabba the Hutt. You know,
Yeah.
that'd be a gory way to
Also,
do
if you
GI
kill
Joe.
someone like that, they don't die. You think they're dead, but they come back in a
Right,
campaign
but
later.
my point is, like, if
So they're
you
fine.
allowed a canon, think about this: if you allowed a canon NPC to be killed, whether the system, whether the setting in the story lends itself toward murder or not, which GI Joe most certainly does not, if you allow Serpentor to be killed and that has no material effect on the story moving forward, then who gives a crap?
Yeah.
It was like, you know, cool. I don't know. This is going to sound terrible, but you know, there's a 13-year-old in all of us. Like it was cool to strangle Serpentor with one of his own snakes and watch his eyes bug out of his head, and then he dies. You know, that was cool. But then 2 sessions later, it's like, well, Cobra's still doing Cobra stuff, and Cobra Commander's still like giving speeches, and who cares? He doesn't even use Destro or his little Serpentor's flying platform. That's why I say that I would personally, I would lean toward a very light touch and an occasional appearance of canon characters and occasional involvement to emphasize parts of the story. You don't have to worry so much about the mechanical side. You can play fast and loose using more like a narrative approach with some, you know, a pool of successes.
I think
Because they're
just
just
in
not, they're
GI
not that
Joe, I
deeply
think
involved.
yeah, I think in GI Joe that's almost impossible though, because you are always fighting Cobra.
Yeah. Cobra Commander is going to show up at some point.
Now, so if we finish off with Star Wars, then Star Wars, I do completely agree with what you just said. And partly because of the fact that it's not just about canon characters, there is a very clear canon storyline.
Sure.
Now, and that is part of the reason why, I mean, actually, it used to be that in like the old games, and even now they suggest it, you play in the period between Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. And funny, the last time they did the comic run, that's when they had the comic set. The comics basically started straight after New Hope, and they ran through until Empire. But actually, recently they decided we're going to go past Empire. They've got a run of comics then. Well, there's no Han Solo because Han Solo is in Carbonite in Jabba's palace and stuff. You're like, well, there's no Han Solo. This isn't Star Wars. Actually, now you look at it and go, the better time period to set Star Wars is that massive ass time period after Order 66 all the way up to A New Hope, because you've got like a 20-year time period where we don't entirely know what's happening and the big players aren't really doing a lot.
They're growing.
Darth Vader, the Emperor is in the background. Darth Vader is going around and he finds Jedi, he's killing them. But I mean, Darth Vader is a perfect example there of what you were saying. Like, if you want Darth Vader, like if you want to play in that time period and one of your characters is a Jedi, you have Darth Vader turn up and you have one choice: you run. And you would run Darth Vader exactly like I said. You don't want to. You could stat Darth Vader and run it, but why bother? Just have him or stat him with those ridiculous stats. And so your choice is to run away. If you stay and try and fight Darth Vader in that time period, you're going to die.
That's an interesting idea too with Star Wars, because you can also, that time period would give you a terrific opportunity to go everywhere but Tatooine. You know, as think about this.
There's nothing on Tatooine. There's Luke and he's a kid, and there's Ben, but he's hidden. So
right here, but here's my point. The main Star Wars story that connects episode 3 all the way to A New Hope, that you're talking about, that, or like Order 66 that precedes that. So Order 66 to A New Hope, you have this era where at the tail end of that is Rebels, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. My take on Rebels is that there's not only one group of rebels. Like the idea of the rebellion is not it's not just growing in one place. Like Rebels is a story of the rebellion as it grows in one place. That doesn't mean, like, I mean, the American War for Independence and the push against the imperial during the imperial crisis of the 1760s, like people in Boston had a problem with stuff, people in New York had a problem with stuff, people in Boston had a problem. So it's not just like one single place and everything is shaped and tempered by those personalities. So you could easily have a rebellion, or what will eventually be the rebellion, capital R, growing elsewhere. And so you don't have to. Tatooine is just another freaking planet.
Well, there's no reason anyone would go there, other than the fact that Jabba the Hutt lives there. It's a backwater dust
Jabba
bowl
the Hutt. You know,
no one cares about.
Yeah, nobody cares. So you create your own corner of the Star Wars universe, which then, as you said, if you're a Jedi, Darth Vader shows up, you run, and that then enables you as a GM to drive home like the looming power.
Yeah,
and that's cool. Or you just create your own stuff, and maybe you only use Darth Vader or the Emperor, those characters, named characters, as parts of like news. Like as your rebel
Yeah.
cell gets connected with others who are grouchy about the Empire, you hear about, oh my gosh, this enclave of Force users on blah 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 5 were, they were killed. This guy showed up and he's all in black and he had a lightsaber and he like cut them all to pieces. Then your players are like, dude, Darth Vader, and they get this picture in their mind of mass slaughter, but the characters are learning it. So that's another way to use a canon character as part of the backdrop in the story, but not right in the characters' faces.
Yeah. I mean, I think actually Rebels does a good job of that, because Rebels, there was one whole series where Darth Vader is the main bad guy in that series, really. But then they have to get Ahsoka to come and help them. It's a bit naff. But, like in one series, it's there's the Inquisitors. They introduced the Inquisitors are a problem.
Yeah.
And then in another series, it's Admiral Thrawn, who was introduced but been introduced in books like previously. Yeah. But, in terms of the good guy, Leia might turn up for an episode. Lando turns up for an episode. I don't think they ever meet Han Solo, but I could be wrong about that. But you have kind of characters, they turn up for an episode, which is a 30-minute episode. They're there, they do something, exactly like we said about Star Trek.
But see, that goes back to, at least it seems, that I haven't seen these episodes, but that goes back to my sense of like, you use them lightly, prudently. They act as a flavor. Like there are certain spices that you don't use in great quantity.
Yeah. I mean, across sort of 4 or 5 series of Rebels, you see sort of the main good guy canon characters a handful of times. Yeah. The bad guys get used more, but that's only because Darth Vader gets used for like an entire series. And then when Thrawn gets used, he is a canon character, but he's a canon character that got used, that was basically introduced in Disney canon in Rebels. Before Rebels, like Thrawn had been written in a book, which then was thrown away. So it didn't really count when he got used. And again, the other period you could do after Return of the Jedi, between Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens, you've got like another roughly 20-year time period.
Is that what it is? Okay,
roughly.
Ish.
I mean, it's
all made up anyway.
Yeah. And so again, you can play in that time period. I mean, actually, loads of people don't like the sequel, so they just do your own thing, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But that's the other thing you can do, is you can go, well, actually, we are going to do what if, because that's your two. What happens? Oh well. Your players are playing smugglers. All right, well, we want to play smugglers. We're going to go to Tatooine and we're going to kill the farm boy. Well, the easiest thing is, how the hell would they know where the farm boy is? So easy problem to solve. And the trouble is, like, they know where Leia is. Leia is on site. Yeah, but she's guarded by characters. So if players are going to be stupid, you can stop them. But if they know that, like, if they're at a particular time and place in a really key event, again, you just change the timeline, just tweak it. Or the alternative is to actually go, right, we're going to do a what if. What if Leia was kidnapped in that Obi-Wan series and dies, and then because she then never gets to take R2-D2 and all this other stuff that happens, and everything. But then that's it. Then you're doing a what if. Then you're doing, all right, well, Luke doesn't destroy the Death Star in New Hope, so everything else is different. Well,
yeah, and I mean, in that case, you're taking canon characters and you're tweaking them. You're turning them into something that they're per canon not.
But you can do whatever you want at that point then anyway. You're writing your own Star Wars, storyline. Yeah. Because to me, like to me, Star Wars isn't the story. To me, we did a whole episode on this, what are the key elements of Star Wars? And we said it's things like, it's the Force, it's lightsabers, it's bad guys who wear white for some reason, but their bosses wear black. It's all the weird aliens and all the planets which only have one biome. That's Star Wars. The actual run through of the story is like, okay, that's the Skywalker saga. But to me, Star Wars is all the other stuff. So the example I wanted to bring in when we first did this is a long time ago when I had Brian playing Star Wars, and he had a ship, which it wasn't Millennium Falcon. It was like a similar thing, but I think the cockpit was in the center of the ship as opposed to the sticking out on the right thing. And I had them at one point, they landed and they came across Han Solo and Chewbacca. And then just for the hell of it, he's like, I'm going to go and steal the quad cannons off the Millennium Falcon. Well, that's fine. Because, Han can just get another set of quad cannons and put them on the Millennium Falcon. But it'll always be a funny story that the quad cannons on Brian's ship are ones he stole off the Millennium Falcon. It just was a nice little story. They might have met Han Solo in a bar. And then they robbed his ship. They didn't steal the Millennium Falcon, because then you'd have to find a way of getting it back. But you can steal some of the guns off it, because, well, that didn't matter. But that was a nice little thing, that it was always then, in the rest of the time we played those characters, the guns on the ship were from the Millennium Falcon. But it didn't affect the story.
No, I think
it was a nice little introduction thing there.
Consider also that if you're going to use, as a GM, if you're thinking of using Canon NPCs in any way, I mean, make sure that you and your players are on the same page. Like, obviously, you and Brian know each other, and so you knew that would be, like, when he went to do, you knew, I'm assuming, when you put in Han Solo and Chewbacca, like, there was a range of acceptable behavior that you were like, okay, we're cool on this because we know each other.
I didn't expect him to go and do that.
But
I knew he wouldn't kill Han and Chewie.
No, but I think that there are people, and I know this may come as a surprise, there are some people who are, like, really hardcore about the canon as they define it.
Yeah.
And so if you have a player who has call it a healthy respect for that, the way it should be, and they have a definition of the way. Huh?
I think it's probably unhealthy.
Well,
anyway.
but I'm being facetious.
You're being nice.
I am, that too. But, so if you have someone who's like, oh no, this is, that they're kind of like a canon lawyer like that, and you come in and, Han Solo is like kind of an idiot, or Han Solo is like, he's not smooth with the ladies. Like, he's the guy who picks up the drunk girl at 2:00 in the morning. Like, he's a cad. He's not like, he's a little edge of smarmy. No, like, he's a cad. You don't, and then you piss off the player, because it's like, you put their hero in front of them, and then their hero is like, has crumbs on his shirt or something. I think that you need to know your players.
Yeah.
You need to know your players, obviously, in order to determine where to put these. And as I've said, go ahead.
I would say, if you are playing in a setting where canon characters could exist, I think you need to have a conversation right at the start.
Yeah.
How much do we want to come across them? Is it never? Because we could do never. Or is it all the time? Or is it occasionally? Yeah. Or are they just the people that give us, is our boss Princess Leia, but she tells us what she wants us to do because we're a rebel cell, and then we go on and do it. And so we get to interact with Leia, but she doesn't come on missions with us, that, because there's lots of ways of doing it. That would be nice to have. Not, or is it just they are cameos, they turn up in the closing scene of your episode and say good job and buy you a bit.
Princess Leia gives you a medallion, and Chewbacca again gets left out.
I never noticed that as a kid. It was only recently that people make
up. Chewbacca doesn't get crap.
Chewbacca
he just stands there. You know why he was going roar? It wasn't in it. You know what? You know what that was? I'm not going to repeat what he was saying in Wookiee.
R2-D2 was on one of the ships as well, though. He didn't get a friggin' medal.
The freaking droid.
Thank you.
It's a freaking droid. We'll just
he was a droid like that. That one droid is responsible for so much stuff.
I know. That's patient zero of the entire story. It's not the Skywalker legacy or whatever. It's the R2-D2. Anyway,
exactly. Forget all them. It's R2-D2 show. But got.
All right. So the next time we pick this up, we're going to talk about fantasy properties. We're going to talk about Forgotten Realms, because there are enough.
You've already mentioned the big problem in there. I know there's two of them, isn't there?
Yeah, we're going to talk about damn balloons keep appearing. I don't know how it's something on my operating system. I don't know how. Let me point up, and then I just look like I'm pointing. How about go like that?
You just suddenly disappeared and were replaced by a balloon.
Anyway, for those just listening, ignore that part. Anyway, so we're going to hit Forgotten Realms. We're going to hit Middle Earth.
We should do Dragonlance, because
Dragonlance.
That's very
any other fantasy or other properties. I think those are probably.
I'm sure we can think of some before then, but
I don't think we need to. I think those three. I think those three work.
Yes.
So
I think
we'll pick this up.
Three good mixes of stuff.
Yeah. That's a good point, because the characters there are power issues that are different. There are mechanical issues depending on the system you use.
There's also story issues, because Forgotten Realms is almost like it's a setting you can play in and there's characters in it. Whereas to me, Dragonlance is one very specific story at one very specific time, which is kind of like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the story. It's like for me, Forgotten Realms is setting first, and then the stories, whereas Dragonlance is the other way around. Like Kryn,
Yes.
you suss out of the story of Dragonlance.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll hit that in another. I don't know if it'll be our next episode, but we'll hit that in an upcoming episode. Word. Thank you so much for listening. You can visit our show's homepage at anchor.fm/fluffncrunch. That's FLUFFNCRUNCH. We would really appreciate feedback and reviews on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to this on. Thanks so much.